Y'all love to talk about color science lately. I don't know what it is. Like a couple of years ago, it was dynamic range and then bokeh, and then everybody was like micro contrast, 3D pop. What about that? But nowadays, like literally, I'm getting 10 comments a day going on about color science, and people are often using it to justify their camera choice in weird ways. Like I'll come out with a review where I'm like, oh, this camera, it doesn't focus very well. It doesn't get shots in focus. This other camera focuses better. And they'll be like, okay, but what about the color science? Sure, that camera gets shots in focus, but the skin tones have green underneath them. Stuff like that. So I did a poll and more than 1,500 people responded. Thank you so much to everybody who participated. And we have real scientific data to back up what the validity of color science. I'm going to tell you which brands have the best and worst color science. And if you have one of the brands that has terrible color science, I'm also going to show you a really easy trick on how to fix it because it's actually pretty simple. First of all, I snuck a question in there that would allow me to determine what brand loyalty people had, because I wanted to make sure that people weren't just saying, oh, I bought a Fuji, therefore Fuji must have the best color because I bought a Fuji. This happens a lot in the camera world. Whatever people get is automatically the best, and they publicly voice that over and over and over again. So I asked people what camera maker they thought had the best color. 29% of people said they didn't know or it didn't matter. And I was actually surprised that it was such a small number. Like more than 70% of y'all have a feeling about who has the best color science. And that's not something we really, we don't talk about it that much. So 28.6% of you said it was Canon. And that's the biggest chunk. And that kind of makes sense because there are more Canon cameras out there than any other manufacturer. Number two was Fuji, which is not the number two manufacturer. That would be Sony or Nikon. But people definitely have this idea that Fuji has the best color or great color, and we'll find out if that's true in just a minute. The third place, people picked Nikon, and in fourth place, they picked Sony. And all other manufacturers, including Leica and Hasselblad, like companies that I think of as putting a lot of energy into color science, they were really small, far way down on the list. I also asked people what their skill was as a photographer, asking people to kind of self-assess this. Just so you know, almost everybody who took the test considered themselves a photographer. Only a few people didn't. 18.5% of you consider yourselves as beginners. Almost half of you consider yourselves intermediate. A quarter of you consider yourself advanced. And then a small sliver consider themselves experts. And I thought that was interesting because I'm sure I have more expert photographers out there, but photographers tend to be kind of humble. I found almost nobody considers themselves an experts. If you talk to legends in the field, which I've had the chance to, they are very humble about it. They're like, oh no, I am still in the learning process. And it's kind of true. So here's the trick question I snuck in there to test brand loyalty. This is the same set of 4 pictures grouped together. The first time you saw it, I numbered that. And the second time you saw it, I put brand names in there. And those brand names are fake. They don't even match up to the pictures. And then I just changed the order of the pictures. So you're looking at exactly the same pictures, and hopefully you would pick the same favorite and least favorite both times. If you did not have any brand loyalty and you were able to perceive these color differences, then your answers to these 2 questions would have matched up perfectly. And almost nobody matched up perfectly. It turns out people have really strong brand loyalties. You love your brand in particular. Universally, the brand that you picked as having the favorite color was the one that you thought had the best color here, even though it made no sense because you'd already told me what you really think a couple of minutes earlier in the post. So who has the most brand loyalty? It's Canon. Canon users were 3.1 times more likely to pick the picture labeled as Canon than when it was labeled as number 2 or whatever it was. Same for Sony. Sony users were only 2.2 times more likely, but that's still a big jump. More than twice as likely to pick the same picture as being your favorite because I wrote Sony over it. So maybe good advice to photographers, just write like Canon or Sony on your picture and everybody be like, whoa, That's some brilliant color science you got going on there. In third place, Nikon users were just 50% more likely to pick it when I put Nikon on it. And Fuji users were actually the least loyal. They were only 40% more likely. Maybe Fuji users are actually the most rational people. I also asked people which of those pictures they thought was the worst. And this is interesting because the picture, when they were numbered, the picture that was most popular, number one, became the very least popular picture when I wrote Fujifilm on it. Yes, they went from being the best to the worst picture in the set, and all I did was write Fujifilm in the corner. All the Canon, Nikon, and Sony users picked that as their least favorite picture, even though it was exactly the same picture. I don't know what's all this animosity towards Fujifilm. I would really be curious to hear why you think photographers with other brands hate Fujifilm cameras so much. Is it because Fuji users are always talking about color science? It's something that Fuji marketing pushes a lot. Is it because Fuji users are so like aggressive and angry online? I really believe Fuji users are they have the meanest set of users. I'm not saying all Fuji users are like that, but there are a set of really hostile self-identifying Fuji users out there who kind of give the whole brand a bad name. Fuji users only hate Sony. They did not downvote the Canon or Nikon, and they certainly didn't downvote the Fuji pictures, but they heavily downvoted Sony. So that tells us a little bit about the brand rivalries. Next up, I'd like to point out there is no right or wrong answer with color and color science. When you look at a picture, people don't necessarily pick the one with the most true colors. And in fact, it was pretty clear people were picking pictures that did not have true colors. And we're kind of used to this all the time. If you go from LED lights to being under halogen lights or incandescent lights, like your whole world is changing color dramatically from yellows and greens to blues, and your brain just kind of adapts to that. I think if you have a monitor where the color is terribly off and you look at it for 5 minutes, then everything looks completely normal. I've experienced this over and over and over again. Fake color is totally okay. Just about every movie and TV show you watch has fake artificial color on it. It's color grading. There are people whose whole job is just to grade TV shows and movies, and they do that all day, just applying fake color to it. Movies and TV shows change colors to totally crazy stuff to support the mood or the genre. And I showed you a couple of pictures in this poll. One of Breaking Bad there showed that I never liked the color grading on Breaking Bad. I know people love the colors, but I thought it was way too saturated. And then Game of Thrones. Again, I like the color grading in Game of Thrones, but it's really heavy-handed, as these two stills show. You can see by looking at the Breaking Bad picture here, it is bright and oversaturated, and the Game of Thrones one is just dark and just very, very, very blue. So what I did was I showed you those pictures, and I had you separately rate pictures that had more natural colors, and it turns out people didn't care one way or another. They actually preferred the oversaturated, overwarm Breaking Bad colors, and they slightly preferred my more neutral grading of Game of Thrones. But either way, people were fine when they saw these what are pretty ridiculous colors. Like if this came straight out of camera for stills, you'd be like, what is going on? The color is completely wrong. But then you watch a TV show with those colors and you like give it Emmys and Oscars and stuff. So next, I'd like to make the point that color science really applies mostly to JPEG files and video. If you shoot RAW, your RAW processor takes all that sensor data, the red, greens, blues, and combines them using its own algorithms. And it's that process of taking the raw data and putting it into a JPEG that is most of what color science is. So if you run everything through Lightroom or Capture One, you could take pictures in RAW with these cameras and they would come out looking about the same. That is the goal of the RAW processor, is to neutralize the output from any camera so it looks the same, and it works great. As somebody who switches cameras all the time, I can switch between them in the same shoot and they will pretty much look identical when I shoot RAW. There's a little bit more to color science than that. like when you're designing the bare filter that goes over the sensor, the little red, green, blue filter that separates the color for each individual pixel, you can adjust the strength and the frequencies that each of those filters. So they usually overlap some, but you could set it to overlap a lot or very little. Hasselblad has some great videos that talk about how they use very narrow color frequencies to give you more pure color. So color science is kind of complex, but when it boils down to it, what really counts is how we perceive it, what we like and what we don't like, and what our customers and clients like and don't like. Here's something interesting. All the pictures in my poll were snapshots. I didn't want to get too artsy with it. I didn't want to distract people with the subject. I wanted them to be very casual and natural environments. I took it in different lights, indoors, outdoors, and in this particular picture, I took it in my kitchen of my wife, so I know personally what color these things are. And this particular camera, taken with the Nikon Z7, got the color completely wrong. It is way, way, way too warm. I don't know why, but it was your favorite picture. That's the crazy thing. I looked at it and I was like, whoa, this camera is going to do terribly because it completely screwed up the color. No, you loved it. And this is something that's true. People love warm tones in portraits. If you want people to like the color of your portrait, just take that color balance, that white balance, and just slide it towards warm just a little bit. This is something Chelsea's always done with her portraits, but I've stayed away from. Like, I find myself liking very neutral colors. Just warm your portraits up a little bit, and that'll do way more for everything than picking a camera with different color science, it turns out. Because I think color is like wine. And when I say this, I mean, it's mostly full of bullcrap. Because I've known friends who are total wine experts, and they will go on and on about the fragrances and what the grapes were like that summer in France. And then if I give them a blind test, which is something I like to do, I will find that they will pick the cheap wine, or they will not be able to distinguish between their favorite wine that they drink regularly and some cheap box wine. And color is kind of like that too. People talk a lot about how important color science is, but when I gave them a blind side-by-side test and asked them to pick their favorites, the results were not at all what they thought. So here's part of what I did. I showed pictures to people individually at first. You didn't see it side by side with anything. For example, this picture of my daughter here, people rated this picture as good, just kind of in the middle. They didn't say it was great or terrible, it was fine. But then I took the same picture and put it in a set of 4 other pictures taken with different cameras, and now they rated that picture as terrible. They said it was really bad. And the point I want to make is I think color science is overblown because we frequently look at comparisons where we see it side by side with other cameras. If you look at pictures individually, your brain will automatically figure out like, hey, I know what skin color looks like. The color on that looks fine. Your brain actually adjusts everything. And if you've seen that blue, black, gold dress optical illusion thing, then you might know what I'm talking about because people see it differently. In other words, your brain kind of applies auto white balance to all the pictures that it sees anyway, unless you show them directly side by side, and that tricks your brain. And now suddenly you will notice the little differences in color, like this desk in number 4 here is a slightly different color than it is in number 1. But in the real world, nobody presents pictures to a client by saying, here's one I took with Sony, here's one I took with Canon, which one do you like better? No, you just present them one picture and they're perfectly happy with the color no matter what camera it was taken on. But as photographers, we frequently watch camera reviews and we look at these side-by-side comparisons, and this is tricking us into thinking that color science is far more important than it is to our clients, at least. And it's like bokeh. It's one of those things where, like, unless somebody points it out to you and shows it side by side, it doesn't really matter at all. I also learned that white balance is more important than color science. Here is the test I did. In the poll, I again showed people the exact same picture, but this time I showed it without white balance and with white balance. And when I showed you the pictures from the 4 cameras without any white balance, just using the camera's automatic white balance. These are all JPEGs, by the way. people had very strong feelings about the best and the worst. Almost nobody said the color didn't matter. People felt strongly it mattered. All I did was I took the little dropper in Lightroom to automatically set white balance off of something white, a little card back there. I clicked the same object in all 4 pictures, and suddenly almost all of you thought that the color no longer mattered. And the remaining people who did think there was a difference were evenly distributed between those 4 pictures. So there was no longer a winner or loser. So in other words, if you find out based on watching this that your camera has the lowest rated color science according to people, just know how to set the white balance automatically. Here's the thing, as when we were shooting commercial photography or portrait photography or whatever we're doing, we adjust the color on every single picture anyway. So as soon as you start to make any tweaks to the color, you pretty much invalidate whatever color science you might be getting out of your camera. And that's the lesson I'm taking from all of this. And we always process the color on any pictures that we share externally. And that's part of why I think I haven't cared that much about color balance. 8% is the number of you who could consistently pick the same pictures when presented the exact same pictures a couple of minutes apart. I'll say that a different way. Let me go back here. This is what I'm talking about. I showed the 1,500 people these 4 pictures and asked them to pick which ones were the best and which ones were the worst. I then showed them the exact same pictures but changing the label. 92% of you picked different pictures for the second set, even though the pictures were identical. They were just in a different order. Only 8% of you could manage to pick the same favorites, just like 1 minute apart. And what that means to me is I don't see a lot of consistency. It doesn't seem to be a powerful drive. I gave people the option of saying that there was no best or worst, that there was no difference, but people still said that there was a best and a worst in these examples. But then they could not reproduce those same results looking at the exact same pictures just a couple of minutes later. And what that tells me is people feel like color science is very important, and yet they're not able to repeatedly say that the same picture is good or bad looking at it just a couple of minutes later. So maybe color science isn't quite as important as we actually think. If it was important, you'd be able to say that this one's bad and it would still be the worst 1 minute later, right? But 8% of you could pick the same one, same pictures. And what I thought was interesting was this 8% picked a different favorite camera. Okay, here are the winners and losers. And I'm shocked by this because this does not line up with public perception. This is not the order that I expected to get. The camera with the #1 best color was Sony. And I was taken aback by this. You picked Sony. This is not my feeling on this. This is just me adding up the votes for people who thought the Sony pictures were the best, subtracting out the pictures that you thought were the worst, and then coming up with this score. And it's not a small margin. Sony got way more points than any of the other competitors. You consistently liked the color of the Sony pictures better than the others. These are all fully automatic, straight out of camera JPEGs, similar colors to what you would see in the video. The example I used here was the A7R III, but in my experience, the color science across brands seems to be pretty similar. #2 was the Fuji. And this isn't a huge surprise. Fuji often talks about color science. People seem to really respect the color science, and the results from, I used an X-T3, were good. They were more positive than negative. This is shocking though. Nikon and Canon got terrible scores. You can see their scores are in the negative, and I didn't think any of the cameras were going to be in the negative. But when you looked at these pictures, more people thought the Nikon and Canon pictures had bad color than thought they had good color. People actively disliked the color of these cameras when looking at them side by side with pictures from Sony and Fuji. I should go back to that slide earlier when the biggest group of people thought Canon had the best color. The third biggest group thought Nikon had the best color, and you guys were, well, you were wrong according to the 1,500 people who took this poll. In a blind test, Sony has the best color, Fuji number 2, Nikon number 3, and Canon number 4. This is just one test. My test is not perfect. I certainly would have loved to have tested way more people. I would have loved to included pictures from 20 different cameras. I would have loved to have shown you 100 different examples taken under a wide variety of scenarios. But the thing about doing any sort of poll is you are testing people's patience, and I needed to keep the poll under 5 minutes and test the stuff that I thought was most important and try to extract as much data as efficiently as possible. If I were to make the poll 20 minutes long, I would at some point only be testing people who had a massive attention span, and that in itself would skew the results. I would love for you, before you get super mad and try to tell me that this poll is BS because you have so much brand loyalty that I was talking about earlier, before you try to tear this down, please go out and reproduce my results, because that is the scientific process. One person creates a study and finds one result, and then somebody else tries to reproduce those results. So please create your own study, take your own pictures with different cameras and put it out there, but make it a blind test and try to figure out what people think. Because I would love to create a meta study where we look at 5 or 6 different studies, but as far as I can tell, nobody has ever really done a blind test of color science. My friend Greg Skoblet had written an article that I did not know about before this, but that I found afterwards. You can read it at sdp.io/color2, and I present that as a second opinion. This is the only study from 2018 with recent cameras in it that I could find. I can't find anybody else who's ever done a color science comparison, despite the fact that so many people are talking about it. And this study happens to have put the cameras in the exact same order, with Nikon and Canon at the bottom and Sony and Fuji at the top. He also included like Panasonic and a few others, so check it out. Please subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. How full of crap am I? I know some of you, if your camera didn't win, you're going to be super upset about it. I did not expect Canon to be in last place, and I certainly didn't expect Sony to be in first place after so many people telling me how great Canon color was and how terrible Sony color was. If you actually want to learn photography, something that'll make a way bigger difference than learning to tweak your colors or shifting your color sciences, head to northrop.photo. That's our store. You can use the coupon code PIXEL for 20% off, or you can go to Amazon and just search for Tony Northrop and check out our books and videos there, because you can actually see the reviews and you'll see that they're pretty good. All right. Thanks. Love to hear your thoughts. Bye.